"You don't belong here." That's what she said before I'd even pulled the chair all the way out. Her voice was flat, loud enough for the whole table to hear, like a slap disguised as a sentence. I didn't move right away. My hand stayed on the chair back, fingers tightening against the wood. I could feel the stares ripple down the table like falling dominoes. Glances darted between plates. Wine glasses froze midair, mouths paused over bites. But no one said a word. No one stood. I just looked at her, this woman I had smiled at 3 times before tonight, thinking maybe we could finally put things behind us. The room was warm, linen, napkins, dim lights, laughter that wasn't mine. I had been invited, technically out of obligation, not affection, and I knew it still. I came. Still, I wore the good blouse. Still, I brought the wine. She sat with her back too straight and her hands folded in perfect stillness, as if she'd rehearsed this moment. "Wrong family," she added. "Wrong side of the table," and that's when I knew this wasn't about seating. It was about space, power, history. I stood there, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I had 2 choices, shrink and leave quietly, or answer, but not with anger, not with shame, with truth. So I reached into my bag, pulled out the folder I had tucked in weeks ago, and laid the deed on the table. Quietly, deliberately. Her eyes didn't move at first, but everyone else's did. And just like that, the room didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to the one she tried to erase. I hadn't planned to pull it out that night. The deed had been in my bag for weeks, folded carefully inside a manila folder with worn edges and a faint coffee stain on the corner. It wasn't for show. It was for protects mine. I carried it like a quiet weapon, not to attack, but to remind myself that I wasn't crazy, that I had built something, that I had earned my seat. She looked down finally, her eyes scanning. The bolded name, my name on the official paper, resting between the salt shaker and a half-finished bread basket. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than anything I could have shouted. Her lips parted like she might laugh, but no sound came out. I caught the flicker of confusion in her expression. She hadn't expected this. Not from me. Because people like me are supposed to disappear when shamed. We're expected to nod, to shrink, to keep the peace for the sake of family. But that night I chose presence over politeness. The room shifted. Someone cleared their throat. A fork clinked against a plate. Still, no one spoke. It's strange how the air can turn so thick so quickly. I sat down slowly, not to challenge Herbert, because the seat had always been mine. I'd paid for that dining room, for the roof overhead, for the electric candles on the centerpiece she now pretended to have chosen. The silence wasn't awkward for me. It was earned. And in that stillness, I didn't need anyone to clap. I just needed them to see. And for once they did. She tried to recover, of course. Straightened her posture, reached for her wine glass, muttered something about confusion and surprise paperwork. But the spell had broken. People didn't laugh this time. They looked down at their plates or at me, unsure where their loyalties should land now that the hierarchy had been quietly undone. I didn't need them to defend me. I didn't even need them to like me. I just needed them to know that I was done pretending I was a guest in a home I helped build. Years ago, I was the one who took the phone calls, signed the forms, wrote the checks. I was the one who stayed late with the lawyer, who fixed the plumbing when it flooded on Christmas Eve. But in this family, memory is selective, and I've learned that sometimes you don't correct people with arguments, you correct them with receipts. I glanced at her once more, and her eyes quickly shifted to her plate. Good. Let her feel the weight of a name she tried to erase. Let her sit with it, not as punishment but as proof. Because I didn't come to beg for space. I came to claim it. As I picked up my fork, I felt something loosen inside me. A knot I hadn't known was there began to unwind. Not because she'd changed, she hadn't, but because I had. The room wasn't warmer and the food wasn't sweeter. But I tasted something I hadn't felt in a long time. Dignity. And when I passed the bread basket to the cousin beside me, I did it not as a peace offering, but as a woman who no longer needed to prove she belonged, because this time, I already knew. It wasn't the first time someone told me I didn't belong. Not even close. I'd heard it in different forms, my whole life, some subtle, some cruel, some wrapped in compliments that sounded like insults if you listened long enough. You've done well for someone like you. It's sweet how hard you try to fit in. That night at the table was just the loudest version. The most public performance of a rejection I'd felt since the first time I walked into their world with my heart open and my sleeves rolled up. I didn't come from money. I didn't come from polished dinner parties and matching napkin rings. I came from scraped knees, long shifts, thrifted dresses, and mothers who taught us to bring a dish even when we weren't sure we'd be welcome. I brought myself to that family with everything I had. I said yes when I should have said wait. I made room when they didn't offer any. I smiled through things I probably should have walked away from. Not because I didn't know better, but because I thought love could build a bridge. Turns out, some people just pull up the planks when you get too close. Still, I stayed. I contributed. I remembered birthdays. I cooked, I fixed things that weren't mine to fix. And when the house went into escrow, it was my name on the wire. Transfer. Funny how that part gets forgotten when the wine starts flowing and the seating chart feels more like a battlefield than a celebration. But in that moment, holding my ground, I wasn't the outsider. I was the architect. And no one gets to exile the person who laid the foundation when I first joined this family. I thought the hardest part would be learning the names and faces, keeping track of who liked what wine and who didn't speak to whom. I didn't realize the real challenge would be surviving the invisible tests. The way they'd smile with their mouths and measure with their eyes, how they'd comment on my dress like it was a costume, or pause when I mentioned my job like they were doing the math between my income and their vacations. I told myself it was just unfamiliarity, that over time I'd prove myself. That once they saw how hard I worked, how much I gave, they'd fold me in like one of their own. So I gave and gave and gave. I memorized their recipes. I helped paint the guest room. I hosted Christmas twice. And every time I was left out of the group photos or the thank you speeches, I reminded myself, they just forgot. But they didn't forget. They chose not to see. Because seeing me would mean acknowledging the shape I carved into their lives. It would mean sharing the credit, sharing the narrative. And some people would rather rewrite history than make room. In the present, that's what I finally understood the night she said, "You don't belong here." She wasn't stating a fact. She was reinforcing a system, one where some people are always hosts and others are always visitors. But I had quietly rewritten the blueprints while they looked away. And that deed, it wasn't just a document. It was my declaration that I had stopped auditioning and started owning. After that night, I didn't replay her words the way I usually would. I didn't lie awake wondering what I could have said differently, how I might have softened the moment. That used to be my pattern, absorbing blame just to keep the peace. But this time I felt something new, relief. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, but because the veil had dropped. She'd finally said out loud what I'd felt in glances and half smiles for years. And now that the truth had a voice, I didn't have to question myself anymore. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't being sensitive. I wasn't overreacting. I was just finally done pretending I hadn't noticed. And strangely, that gave me power. I didn't need to prove anything at future gatherings. I didn't need to overextend, overgive, or overcompensate for a space I'd already earned. Because I wasn't there to impress. I was there because I built a life that no one could take from me. I realized that what she hated most wasn't my presence, it was my permanence. She couldn't erase the paperwork. She couldn't rewrite the records. She couldn't make my sacrifices disappear just because they made her uncomfortable. And once I stopped needing her approval, her voice got a lot smaller in my head. I began to hear my own voice again, the one that reminded me of everything I overcame to sit at that table in the first place. The one that said, "You belong not because they said so, but because you decided to stay standing." And in that quiet decision, I reclaimed something I'd given away too easily for too long. My authority, not just over the property, but over my presence. I started changing things around the house after that dinner. Not big things, just the kind of changes that make a space feel like it's finally breathing with you, not against you. I painted the hallway a soft sage green, took down the framed photo that used to hang by the stairs, the one where everyone else smiled like they belonged, and I stood stiff on the edge, cropped by the frame. I replaced it with a landscape I'd always loved but never displayed. Then I cleared out the drawer full of takeout menus and found a folder labeled household filled with receipts, permits, and yes, the deed again. I sat on the living room floor and laid it all out in front of me, like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I'd finished assembling. And for once, I didn't cry. I felt proud. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that settles into your bones and whispers, "You did this." I stopped hosting for a while. Not out of spite, but out of rest. I needed to know what it felt like to live in a space that didn't require performance. No centerpieces, no code switching, no translating my presence into something more acceptable. Just me, a cup of tea, and a home that no longer felt like someone else's idea of mine. I realized that belonging doesn't come from being accepted. It comes from accepting yourself so deeply, no one's rejection can shake the ground beneath you. And when I passed by the mirror in the hallway, I finally looked at myself not to check if I looked presentable, but to acknowledge the woman who stayed, endured, she belonged, she always had. It just took me this long to agree with her. One morning I woke up before sunrise and made myself breakfast. Not the kind you throw together standing by the sink, but something soft, deliberate. I scrambled eggs the way I liked them, with chives and a little too much butter. toasted bread until golden, brewed coffee, and sat by the window before the world woke up. No one was there to see it. No one to post it or applaud it or tell me it looked peaceful. But it was. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't borrowing the DI, I was living it. I wasn't waiting for someone else to decide my worth. The silence didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt earned, like I had finally stepped out of the waiting room of someone else's approval and into the home I forgot I built. I started saying no to things that drained me. I stopped accepting half invitations, stopped replying to people who only called when they needed a favor. Not out of anger, but clarity. My kindness had never been the problem. It was my exhaustion pretending it came free. That week, I donated 3 bags of things I had kept for the sake of appearances. Dresses I never felt right in. Platters I only used when they came over. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. I didn't need their validation. I didn't even want it anymore. What I wanted was to walk through my life without shrinking, without translating my presence into something more palatable, without folding myself up so someone else could feel taller. And every small act of honesty, every no, every boundary, every cup of coffee at Dawnby came a way of telling myself, you're not waiting anymore, you're here, and this is yours. Later that week, I hosted someone for the first time since that dinner, but not from their side of the family. It was an old friend I hadn't seen in years, someone who knew me before the edits, before the performances, before the constant second-guessing. She stepped into my home and looked around like she could feel the air breathing easier. It feels like you, she said, and I nearly cried. Not because it was a compliment, but because it was the first time in so long that anyone had looked at my space and seen me in it, not a version. I had to decorate for someone else's comfort. We sat at the table, the same one where I'd been told I didn't belong, only this time no one was performing. We drank tea and talked like time hadn't passed, and when I told her about what happened at the dinner, about the folder, the silence, the diet, she didn't say, you're better than that. She said, you deserved better. And somehow, that difference mattered. I didn't need someone to lift me above it. I just needed someone to see me without asking me to disappear. After she left, I lit a candle, not because I was entertaining, but because the room felt sacred now. I walked past that chair, the one I'd been told not to sit in, and this time I sat without hesitation. No folder, no defense, just me, in my own home, at my own table. And that moment, more than the paperwork or the property, became the quiet declaration I had longed for. I am not a guest. I'm not an accident. I'm not optional. I'm home, and I'm not moving. A month later, I mailed her a copy of the deed. No note, no explanation, just the document, folded neatly inside an envelope with her name handwritten on the front. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even a message. It was closure for me. I had carried that moment at the dinner table like a stone in my chest, even after reclaiming my space, and I knew if I didn't put it down for good, it would follow me into every quiet moment I tried to build. By sending her the paper, I gave her a mirror, let her look at it, let her sit with the weight of it alone without my voice explaining or justifying. I don't know what she did when she opened it. Maybe she tore it up. Maybe she laughed. Or maybe, for the first time, she had to sit still with the truth she'd tried so long to rewrite, that I wasn't temporary, that I wasn't a placeholder, that I had been there the whole time, laying bricks, keeping lights on, making meals, absorbing silence, and that the foundation she sat on wasn't hers. It was mine. After I dropped the envelope in the mail slot, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt light, like I had finally stopped trying to win a war I never declared. Because the moment she said, you don't belong here, she told me everything I needed to stop asking for. And in return, I offered her one last thing, not an argument, not a plea, just the truth, on paper, a signature, and a silence that no longer hurt because this time, I chose it. In the weeks that followed, I stopped bracing for her response. I didn't check my phone expecting a message. I didn't rehearse conversations in the shower. That version of Mitha, one who needed to be acknowledged, needed the confrontation, the apology. The admission that version had gently stepped aside. What replaced her wasn't colder, just quieter. Wiser? I didn't want to win. I just wanted peace. So I gave myself what I'd been waiting for others to deliver. I walked through my home barefoot again. I played old records while cleaning. I framed a photo of myself, smiling really, smiling, and put it in the entryway, where all the other family portraits used to hang. Not out of vanity, but because I finally understood a home should reflect its keeper. And I was done erasing myself from mine. People came and went. Some noticed the changes, some didn't, and I didn't explain. Because healing doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes it's enough to just feel the floor beneath you and know it's yours. To sit at a table you paid for, under a roof you held together, and breathe. Without apology, that was my quiet revolution. Not a raised voice or a slammed door, but the kind of stillness that comes after weathering a storm no one saw you survive. The kind where you finally stop proving and start becoming. And in that becoming, I found pieces of myself I thought were lost. Laughter that didn't ask permission. Rest that didn't need to be earned. And a softness I feared I'd given. Away forever? But it had just been waiting for me to come home and recognize it as mine. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees outside my kitchen window, I lit a single candle and sat at the table with a cup of tea. No celebration, no visitors. Just me, the scent of lavender from the wick and the hum of the house settling into its bones. I looked around at everything I had chosen. The warm-toned walls, the mismatched dishes I loved, the photo of my younger self laughing on the beach pinned above the doorway. I remembered all the moments I had swallowed in silence, the way my name was skipped in toasts, the glances that passed over me when decisions were made, the times I was present but not counted. And instead of letting those memories hollow me out again, I simply nodded to them. Yes, you happened. Yes, you hurt. And now, you're done shaping me, because I am not their absence of acknowledgement. I am not the space they never offered. I am what remained standing, what refused to collapse, what made a home in the echo of rejection and filled it with grace. I sipped my tea slowly and whispered, to no one in particular, I belong to myself now. It didn't echo, but it didn't need to. The room already knew. This space no longer waited for approval to feel full. It breathed in sync with the rhythm I set, quiet, steady, whole, and I understood, finally, that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a candle, a cup of tea, a name spoken gently by your own lips. And when I rose from the table and turned off the light, I didn't look back with longing, only with love, because the version of me that stayed behind had finally made it home. The next time she visited, it was unannounced. She rang the bell like she had a right to be let in. And maybe, once, I would have rushed to open the door, fixed my hair, straightened the cushions, made space for her presence like it somehow validated mine. But this time, I walked slowly. I didn't smile. I didn't perform. I opened the door and waited. She stepped inside with that same tight smile she wore at the dinner table, the one that always meant I'm tolerating you. She looked around and something in her posture shifted. The walls had changed. The energy had changed. I had changed. She stood there like a guest in a place she used to command, and for the first time she seemed unsure of what to say. She gestured toward the table, said, "This looks different." I nodded. "It is." No apology, no invitation, just truth. She opened her mouth, maybe to repeat an old script, but I gently cut in. "I'm not here to fight, but I'm not here to disappear either." She blinked. It was the first time I saw her search for footing. I gestured toward the chair at the end of the table. "You can sit if you like, but you don't set the terms anymore." It wasn't cruel. It was kind to both of us. Because boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks that remind us we choose who gets to stay. And in that moment, I felt no fear, only certainty. That the deed I had handed her once wasn't just paper. It was the shift in gravity from seeking place to owning it. She didn't sit. Not right away. She hovered, fingers grazing the back of the chair as if uncertain whether she was still allowed to. That hesitation was everything. For years I had carried that uncertainty. I had asked for room in whispers, folded myself to fit in frames I was never meant to occupy. But now, the roles had shifted, not out of revenge but restoration. I poured myself a glass of water, didn't offer one. Not out of coldness, but because I didn't need to host someone who never saw me as home. She finally pulled out the chair and sat silent. I didn't fill the space with small talk. I let it breathe. She glanced at the photo on the wall. Me, alone, smiling. She looked at the fresh paint, the new art, the soft colors. "You've made it your own," she said, almost like a question. I nodded once. "Yes, I have." And in that moment, I realized she wasn't just looking at the room, she was looking at me. Really looking. Not to measure or correct, but to understand something she hadn't expected, that I had built something beautiful without her approval, without her guidance, without her voice in my ear. And that unsettled her. But it didn't unsettle me, because I no longer needed her to be wrong for me to be right. I no longer needed her to apologize to feel whole. Her discomfort was not my responsibility. Her silence wasn't mine to fill. I simply sat at my own table, in my own presence, and I let the weight of my enoughness be loud. Not in volume, but in truth. After she left, I didn't watch her walk away. I didn't analyze her tone or wonder what she thought of me now. I simply closed the door, turned the lock with a gentle click, and leaned my back against the wood knot. In defense, but in arrival, I was no longer holding the house together for the sake of being accepted. I was holding myself, and that was enough. Later that night, I took the deed back out from the drawer, not to prove anything, but to remind myself what it symbolized. Not ownership of a building, but ownership of my voice, my history, my boundaries. I placed it inside a new folder labeled Legacy, because that's what this was now. A living, breathing legacy of choosing truth over silence, dignity over approval, presence over performance. I lit a candle and sat again in that same chair she once told me I didn't belong in. This time, I brought with me a small handwritten note I had written years ago and hidden in a book. It said, "One day you'll stop asking for a seat, realize you built the table." I placed it beside my plate, and I smiled, not to anyone, just to myself. Because healing doesn't always come with fireworks or forgiveness. Sometimes it comes quietly with a chair, a key, and a woman who finally knows her worth. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like you had to shrink to fit it? If this story met you there, comment below. This time, I brought the deed.